Hello, this is Bernadette Brady. We're moving on now through this series of tutorials, and what I want to look at now are the editors. And there's two editors in Jigsaw, one for Almutens and the other one for Arabic parts, and we'll look at both of these editors now. Now, if you're not sure about Almutens, this next section may be slightly confusing for you, but if you are into medieval astrology, then this section will really excite you. So let's just click on the Almuten Editor and start looking at all the different options it gives us. Okay, when you open the Almuten Editor, it will actually open your major Jigsaw files and ask you what Almuten file you want to open, because you can create your own Almuten files here. We'll actually just open up the standard Jigsaw one, which you saw being used in the tutorials for the general research tabulate and graph screen. So let's just select jigsaw.alm and click open, and this now opens up the Almuten Editor. If you are a SolarFire user, you should be familiar with this screen. It's very similar, if not identical, to the one in SolarFire. But let's just talk about this. Now, here is the Dignity Almuten definitions. These are the definitions that have already been created in this editor and saved and put into this file. If you want to create a new file, you can edit some of these and then you can save them with a new file name if you want to do that. So these can act as a basis. But what we're going to do is use this standard file to explain some of the workings of this screen. Remember, in the research tutorial on the tabulate and graph screen, we looked at the Almutens and we played around with the Almuten of the angles, and this is the one we actually played around with. We selected this on the list, and it was called Lord of the Angles Profession, and it has a brief name, simply Profession, and it is the Almuten of the angles. Let's re-look at that in this editor to see how it's been constructed and what it looks like. Remember from the diagrams that we could draw up a little grid box of the ascendant, the MC, the descendant and the IC, and then slowly in that chute we scored up the different points in that, and then we actually added them all together, and it gave us Jupiter as being the Almuten of that particular exercise, the Almuten of the angles, or the planet that had the greatest rulership over the four angles. Let's actually look at that again now, but looking at it not only in the little table but also here in the editing screen. Now, the first thing is, if we look down here, the dignity scoring. We talked about how rulership of a point got 5 points. We talked about how exaltation of the point got 4 points. We talked about the 3 triplicity rulers each getting 3 points. We talked about the term ruler getting 2 points. But what we did, we also talked about the face ruler getting 1 point. And here this is set to 0. So let's change this. If we just click this button here, we can put that as 1 point. Now, if you want to change any of these, sometimes people just want to work with the insect triplicity ruler and don't want to take any notice of the other 2 triplicity rulers, then we could highlight it and just make it down to 0, like so, and that would change our entire formula. But let's pop it back to the 3. Okay, this is all we need for this one, for the profession, but we could add a lot more. We could give minus points that if a planet was in detriment. You see, we can go backwards and create minus points if we want to, or in fall. We can actually add points that if the planet is in mutual reception with something, we can actually add points to the score or deduct points from the score, just depending. We can also work with different ways of doing mutual reception. We can do it by rulership, by exaltation, by triplicity, by term, by face. So you can really explore mutual reception. We could also acknowledge the fact that a planet could be the ruler of the day that the person was born, which is a medieval concept, and we could give it points or not. The same with planetary hour. If the planet was peregrine, in other words, had no dignity whatsoever, then we could give it a minus score, going backwards here. If the planet is in a certain house, we could give it a score. Some systems score this up. Sometimes it can be minus or sometimes it can be plus. So what we can do here is we can say how we're going to score the planet. We define what the planet is and then we add a score to it depending on how it sits in the natal chart. So this is the scoring part. Okay, so we're looking at professions, and this is the scoring we're doing. We're simply looking for the Lord of the Angles, and we're doing a very simplistic scoring, almost a standard set of medieval scoring. 5 points rulership, 4 points exaltation, 3 each for the triplicities, and 1 for term, 2 for term, and 1 for face. But wait, just think, there are different forms of triplicity rulers. There are different types of term rulers. So what ones are we using here? If we go up to this button here, options, we can influence the basic sorts of dignities that Jigsaw is going to use for this Almuten. So let's click on options. Here we have it. So the triplicity type, there are 3 basic standard types. Ptolemaic, which are out of the Tetrabiblos. Lily, he reduced them down to 2. Ptolemy did as well, actually. Or Dorothean, which are the ones that I like. So you'll see with me that all of these things will be at my preferences because this is my version of Jigsaw. Okay, so I select the Dorothean triplicity rulers. The term type, I don't like the modifications that Ptolemy made in order to try and neaten up the terms. I like the older terms, the Egyptian terms, so I select the Egyptian terms. Sign boundary. There's a good debate in medieval astrology. Bonatti talks about it, as well as amongst modern astrologers. Is the boundary of the sign at 0 degrees, or does a planet have to get through that 0 degrees and get to 1 degree of a sign before it's there? And this enables you to define how you sort out a sign boundary. Is a sign 1 degree through to 30 degrees of Scorpio, and then Sagittarius starts at 1 degree of Sag through to 30 degrees of Sag, and so on? Or is it, that would be this option, the 1 degree, or is it the standard modern way of simply naught, so that a sign is, say, 0 to 29, 59 of Scorpio, and then Sagittarius starts at 0 degrees to 29, 59, 59 of Sagittarius. So that's what that's talking about. Here, house cusp degree offset. If in Bonatti, as well as other authors, he talks about, and indeed Ptolemy as well, he talks about that if a planet's within so many degrees of an angular house, then you can think of it as angular. And Bonatti gives that if a planet is within 8 degrees of an angular house, you could actually count it as an angular house. If it's within 5 degrees of a succedent house cusp, then count it as being succedent. If it's within 3 degrees of a cadent house cusp, then count it as being cadent. In other words, that if you've got a planet in the 12th house, but it's 8 degrees back from your ascendant, then in this system it would be counted as in the 1st house, angular. Or if you've got a planet in the 3rd house and it's, say, 8 degrees off your IC, then that would be counted as being in the 4th house. But if you had a planet in the 5th house and it was within 2 degrees or 3 degrees of your 6th house cusp, then it would be counted as cadent. So that's what this is doing. You can change those. For many things we simply set these at 0, but for different research projects, different things, you might want to fiddle with that. Okay, here the part of fortune. All astrologers except Ptolemy and I think Lily, who tends to follow Ptolemy, but I may be incorrect in that statement, use a daytime formula only for the part of fortune. Every other astrological thinking, and indeed all the philosophical thinking behind what the part of fortune means and its relationship to the part of spirit, which is its nighttime counterpart, acknowledges a different daytime, nighttime formula. You can make your own choice there, but that's what this is doing. Okay, 2 other things to talk about here. The planetary rulerships. Obviously, here in the dignity score, rulership, exaltation, etc. score big points. So how you allocate those rulerships is very important. Traditional is traditional. You could do modern, which would actually add 5 points for Pluto being in Scorpio, but if Mars was in Scorpio, would not give it any points. I prefer, obviously, traditional. Almutens come out of medieval astrology, and their entire basis is within the foundation of the traditional or old rulerships. So it's a little bit odd to actually push modern rulership concepts into such an ancient concept, but you could play with it. There's other options here, esoteric rulerships and hierarchical rulerships, so you can actually play with those, but for the moment we'll keep those set at traditional. House system, obviously if you're going to talk about house cuss offsets, and obviously if here in this screen here you're working with houses and giving scores for houses, then the house system you use is quite important. So this defaults to using the default one, whatever you're working with, but you could select any house system, so you could actually run the whole system, what you're working with, the Almuten you're building, on a particular house system, different maybe to your default house system. Okay, when you've set this up the way you want it to work, click OK. Right, we're still building this, so we've actually scored up how we want to score the different points. We've talked about here what sort of triplicities we want to use, what rulerships and dignities we want to use, what sort of terms we want to use, and other points about which are not relevant for this Almuten, about parts of fortune and houses and so on. Alright, so now we move to this screen. We can have individual degree dignities, which means that it's simply going to look at the individual dignity of, say, the ascendant, full stop, end of story, or the MC, and that's all. But what we want to do is we want to take the score that the planet gets for the ascendant and add it to the scores that the planets get for the MC, and add it to the scores the planets get for the descendant, and add it to the scores that the planets get to the IC. And that's called summing over points, or a compound Almuten. You can call it different things, but this is what this option is. Now when we select this, we see that for the professions we've already got 4 selected points. Let's just have a look at them. Here they are. Here we have this screen, which you should be sort of familiar with if you have been working with the research module. Here we have the list of points which we are going to work with. We can add and we can remove. If I highlight the ascendant, I can remove that by clicking the removed, and so on. If we want to add a point to this, let us say that we want to add the north node, and we also want to look at the Almutens of the north node and add that to our professional point. We simply click on the north node and click add. No problems, easy. But let's think, oh no, we actually don't want the north node, we want something else. Well, when we look here, we can modify the point. For example, if we wanted to add the sun, but we don't want to add the sun itself, we want to add the ruler of the sun, the dispositor of the sun, we simply go like this, and that's what we've got, the ruler of the sun. Or we could add the first triplicity ruler, the second triplicity ruler, or the third triplicity ruler, or the term ruler, or the face ruler. And then we've added it to our list. You'll see with some of these, other ones I'm going to look at, that this comes into play. Here we've got the points to show. Here are the points showing. Chart points to show. Clearly these are the chart points. Houses, here are the house cusps, so we can say 5th house cusp, the ruler of the 5th house cusp. I'll just remove that. Or some other modifier. Here you should be familiar with modifying things. Other points, we've got the descendant, the IC on this point. So if you were building this from scratch, this is where you'd add the descendant, where you'd add the IC. And then the prenatal new or full moons, or the locked-in new prenatal new or full moon. This option here will actually work out which is the one before you were born, whether you were born just on a waxing moon or a waning moon, and take the appropriate one. Arabic parts, we can open up an Arabic part file. There it is. Click open. Here we are. And we can add an Arabic part of faith. We can put the own position in. We could then do the dispositor of the part of faith, and so on. And then when you're done, you save. And that's, in a sense, this is how Jigsaw would then take any number of charts, it could be thousands and thousands of charts in a file, and calculate this for every single chart. Find the planet that is this the Almuten ruler of the angles, and then we can do something with it. We can look at its house position, we can look at its aspects, we can look at its zodiacal sign, we can look at its phase, we can look at its harmonic components, we can do things with it. We treat it like a normal thing. But the exciting thing about this is that you could say have 10 charts. You could also have 10,000 charts, but let's say you have 10 charts and the Almuten of the angles might be a different planet in each chart, but Jigsaw will take that planet, those 10 different planets, and take those 10 different planets and show you that they might all be in the 12th. But if you look at the 10 different charts, then they've all got a different planet in the 12th or a different planet aspecting the sun. But when you actually let Jigsaw analyse it, you suddenly realise that all of these people have, or most of these people have, this Almuten point, this planet, which is the Almuten of the angles, in aspect to the sun or in a particular house, and so on. So it's a very exciting area of research, and it's almost unlimited in your ability to work with it. Okay, this is a very simplistic Almuten, compound Almuten. Let's look at a much more complicated one. Let's look at this one here called the Almond Divot. The Almond Divot was put together by Guido Bonatti, who was a military astrologer in the 12th and 13th century, an Italian military astrologer. And it was his way of looking at the length of life or the vitality of a chart. And he basically built this very large compound Almuten, which actually contained every planet that would actually give life or give vitality into a chart. Let's look at it. First of all, let's look at the options, and we can see that Bonatti used the Dorothean triplicities, Bonatti used the Egyptian terms, he started the sign boundaries at 0 degrees, he used no angular offset for this particular formula. He used a different, he made sure with the part of fortune that it varied for day or night, and he used traditional rulerships, and he used Alkebuses. We could set this to Alkebuses if we wanted to. That's his preferred house system. If I can find it on the list, there it is there. So we could set that for Alkebuses, and we could say okay. So that's our preferences there for this Almond Divot. Now let's look at what he's done with this. He's got the standard set, rulership, exaltation, the triplicities, the term, the face. Has he got anything else there? And no, he hasn't. So it's basically just working with the essential dignities. But look, he's got 34 selected points. Let's look at them. He wants first of all to take the Almuten of the moon, in other words, to look at the ruler of the moon and give it 5 points, to look at the exalted ruler of the moon, if there is one, and give it 4 points, to look at the 3 triplicity rulers of the moon, depending on the degree and the sign the moon is in, and give them 3 points each, to look at the term, the Egyptian term that the moon is actually in its degree in its zodiac sign, and give that planet 2 points, and to look at the planet that rules the face it's in and give that planet 1 point. So with the moon you would get this string of scores, just like we had for the one of the angles in the earlier example. He does that, and then he does it for the sun. He then does it for the ascendant. He then does it for the midheaven. He then does it for the part of fortune. He then does it for the descendant. He then does it for the IC. So he's got these standard points. But then he does it for the dispositor of the moon. And the way we would build that is you'd actually click on the moon and you'd just click dispositor, and that would add it in. And then he does the dispositor of the sun, and so on. He looks at the rulers of all of these points, and here they are there. And then he goes through and he looks at the first triplicity ruler of those points, and the second triplicity ruler, and the third triplicity ruler of those points. So he is looking then at the triplicity rulers of those points. Then he goes down and he looks at the new or full moon before birth, and he works out where that was. If you were born on a waxing moon, that's called a conjunctional birth, meaning that you were born after the sun and moon had conjunct. You'd go back and look at that position, and that'll be a precise zodiacal degree, and you actually then work out what rules it, what's the exalted ruler of that degree, and so on down the list, and score it up. It's quite intricate and quite complex. And he builds all of that up, and then he compiles that for every single chart. So for every single chart, he will actually do this very, very long list and work it all out. It could take up to half an hour by hand to do it. Jigsaw will do this for you automatically. You could take a data file of several thousand charts or a lot more. Ask it to run and find the Almond Divot for every single chart, which it would do. The Almond Divot could be any of the planets, any of the old planets: Sun, Moon, Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter and Saturn. And he could take any of those points. It would then find out which one it was for each one of your charts in your data set, and then you could actually, having got that, you can think of it like a set point. You can look at the harmonic components of it, you can look to see what house it's in, sign, aspects, and so on. So that's just one of them. There's quite a few here, and what I suggest that you do is you look at them. Here's an individual one, Dignities, to actually see what planet has the greatest dignity in a particular degree. If we look at that, you can see we have the standard set here of rulership, exaltation, and just the insect triplicity ruler. Now, this is how this is set. Nothing for out of sect, nothing for the extra triplicity ruler. 2 for the term, 1 for the face, standard stuff. But look, the detriment of that point. So if we're looking at this now, the detriment at -5, what that's talking about is that if the point that you're looking at is, say, 10 degrees of Capricorn, and the moon actually is in detriment in 10 degrees of Capricorn, so part of the scoring would be the moon would get -5 points when it comes to its involvement with 10 degrees of Capricorn. The same for fall, etc. And you can see on this one, then we've got mutual receptions involved, we've got Peregrine involved, and so on. There's all different ones here, and really the best thing to do is to simply look at them and see how they're constructed. Play around with them. As long as you don't save your results, you can't hurt anything. If you want to, of course, you can play around with them and then save them as their own file, and you could create a new Almond Divot file if you wanted to. So that can be useful. But the real thing here is to play around. The way you save it, of course, is File, Save, Save As. Edit, you can add a new definition here, you can copy a definition, you can paste a definition, you can delete a definition. So this is how you do basic tidying up of your list. Or, as I said, you can copy it. Sometimes, for example, with Bonati's Almond Divot file, it's a very long one. If you wanted to do an edit of that but not delete his but add your own version to it, you don't necessarily want to construct that all over again. So you can do a copy the definition, and then you can do a paste the definition, and there it is, it's put it in there. And then we could say, we could call it Almond Divot 2, and we could call it my Almond Divot, and there you are. Then we could save that file, and it's saved. Or you could save it as a new name and call it something else. Okay, so we've actually just created a new one there, Almond Divot 2. Let's look at how that looks in the research module. Let's close this now, and we've got the actors open. Let's go into the research tabulate and graph. With this open, let's go to more points, and what we want to see is we'll go to chart our mutants. There they are. Let's scroll down, and there it is. So we can simply add that in. So now you could run research work on that particular little variation that you've done on the Almond Divot point. Okay, what we'll do now is we'll have a look at the Arabic Parts Editor, which is far less complicated and much simpler.